Hi, this is Bob Scully, and welcome to another edition of the World Show, Entrepreneurs, the Fiera Series. This week, we welcome back someone you've met before, an entrepreneur in business publishing. He's the author of the Boeckh Investment Letter, a money manager, but especially one of the most astute economic minds in North America today. Tony Boeckh came and sat in our studio a few months ago to give us 5 do's and 5 don'ts for the next president. We didn't know who it would be. Now we know who it is, and we revisit that list, 5 do's and 5 don'ts for President Obama. We hope he's watching. Here's Tony Boeckh. Tony Boeckh, here we are again doing these top 10 lists. You're very good at them, and I know people enjoyed them from the reaction they got last time. Last time we were doing economic do's and don'ts for the future president. We can now, with more assurance, hear from you on what you're recommending for President Obama re-elected. So first do is must show real leadership. Obama's president of all the people. Reach out to moderate Republicans. Communicate effectively with the people that the country has some very big problems. Some medicine now will avoid serious illness later. Problems have been building for decades. Everyone has played a role. Time to stop the blame, but no quick fix. U.S. has enormous capacity to rejuvenate, but it will only happen if the country pulls together.
That's a good start.
So how does he, yeah, if he did just that, boy. But he's going to have a gap there, a credibility gap, I would think.
Yeah. Well, first of all, you know, after every election, it's a time of hope. You know, and I think that goes with every every election. And I think Obama's victory speech, you know, really provided a lot of hope and kind of emotional excitement about the ability of the nation to come together and rejuvenate. But I think Obama's biggest weakness in his first term was that he really didn't show the kind of leadership that people expected. He comes across often as like a university professor or a lawyer. And I think what he's got to do is become a lot more like President Reagan, or Lyndon Johnson, where he can sort of rise above everything and set the agenda and show some real leadership. And sort of he's got to be the CEO of the whole country, and he's got to communicate with the people and really lay it out that there's some big problems. You know, and a lot of people around the world, not just in the U.S., but around the world, have been really concerned about this declinism in the United States. You know, if you look on the bookshelves, the political science section, the economics, they're just full of this sort of stuff. So that's an issue that he's got to come to grips with. He's got to deal with it. He's got to level with the people, say, yeah, we've got some big problems. They go back a long way. They're not cyclical. It's not a question of trying to get unemployment down over the next 6 months or 12 months, but focus on the big picture and what he has to do to rejuvenate the country and what the people have to do to get behind him to, you know, to make all this happen, to execute it.
That was the plan in '08 as well. He was reading Doris Kearns Goodwin on the Lincoln cabinet. When you say Reagan and Johnson, you know, we can go back all the way to Lincoln. These great presidents do bring both sides together, but the other side now hates him.
Well, that's a problem. But you know, I think this is a time of great opportunity, not just because he's won re-election, but I think the Republicans in many ways are in disarray. They've been trying to put together a coalition that is kind of yesterday's coalition. You know, they don't really appeal to a broad cross-section of Americans. They appeal to really special interest groups like the white powerful males, relatively wealthy.
At the golf club.
At the golf club, and Romney really epitomized that. He looked like a golf club guy. And then also the Christian extremist groups, and you can't build a coalition on those two groups. And Obama proved that, where he's got much broader appeal, and so he's got this structural weakness of the Republicans. They're going to have to transform themselves. They're going to have to regroup, and so he's got the momentum on his side to really do things in a hurry.
All right, and let's hope he does. Now, number 2 in your 5 do's, before we get to the 5 don'ts. Set a few key priorities where he can actually accomplish change. Assess where the big ones are, and then get the right people on the team. He needs the right people. Just finish that sentence. He needs the right people to execute. He needs to be a combination, you just said this, of Ronald Reagan and Lyndon Johnson. Reagan was not a detail man. Lyndon Johnson was very much a detail man. He'd have to be perfect to do that. How about assessing what's important and recruiting the right people on those two tasks? How
Yeah,
should he
well,
do it?
that is critically important. You've got to set an agenda that's realistic, and it's got to be limited, because you can't be all things to all people and get involved in the details and get bogged down in the details. So he's got to pick the 3 or 4 or 5 things where he can really do something. Obviously, there's a political dimension to that, because he's got the Democrats behind him, the party as a whole, so he has to pay attention to that. But he's also got to pay attention to what's the right thing to do for his grandchildren and my grandchildren, and to keep the the focus on that and not on the next election. And obviously everybody's got to have one eye on the next election, but there's far too much of that in the United States. It's a continuous election process, and the other thing that's really key that goes with that is picking the people that are going to execute the policy, and not get involved in that so much himself. He's got to pick real leaders who are going to be cabinet secretaries, and pick people for their competence and not for their how much money they gave to the party to get elected.
As regards picking the right problems, a few but the correct ones, do you agree with the truism now that he made a mistake in putting healthcare before the economy, before jobs? That he wasted time and effort on that?
I think that's probably a correct assessment, and that's not to say that healthcare isn't important. I think it's hugely important, but I think he wasted a lot of his political capital on that, and he neglected the economy, and he neglected a lot of bigger structural issues. And also, I'd just like to go back to the point about Reagan and Lyndon Johnson.
Yeah.
Reagan was the big vision guy. He had a big picture of what he had to do, and he got the country behind him. What Lyndon Johnson did was he was the fixer. He's the guy that negotiated behind the scenes with Congress. He knew how to twist the right arms, how to get the right people, cajole them, carrot and stick, the whole bit. And so he needs those 2 qualities.
And that's not in the Obama character, they tell us. Kind of aloof, doesn't take them out for golf, doesn't do the handwritten notes. Can he learn that in a jiffy?
I don't know. I mean, he's still a relatively young guy, but he's got to learn it. That's what he's got to do, and he needs people around him to really mentor him and train him, so that he can really get things done and not just talk about it.
Number 3, fiscal cliff, fiscal viability for the long run. He will have to compromise a lot, probably give up on tax rate increases for rich in exchange for a grand bargain with the House. Tax code overhaul. Get rid of exemptions, focus on competitiveness, long-term match between entitlements and future tax revenue. And that is a biggie, and if he could do that.
That is huge. That's really good, and by the time this program airs, maybe the fiscal cliff issue will have been dealt with. Maybe not. We don't know. But what's critical is he's got to deal with this thing, because if he blows it, he could be a lame duck president by the beginning of the year. And
the entitlements, anybody who's tackled Social Security, whether it's George W. Bush or anybody, hits a wall, tremendous wall.
Yeah.
How do you sell a reform of these huge programs that everybody sees as a necessity?
Yeah, well, that's another question, how you do it, but it's got to be done one way or another, and I think the country understands that it's got to get done. From a long-term structural point of view, you got to get a match between revenue and entitlement expenditures. And the Americans are famous for this. They love their entitlements, but they don't want to pay for them. And I mean, that's human nature. But if you want a lot of entitlements, you got to pay for them. If you don't want to pay, you're going to have less entitlements, and they got to get that message across and sell it. And nobody's been able to do it so far. So if it was easy, it would have been done.
Of course,
it's not easy.
And it's in the list. I mean, he's got to try to do it. Number 4, focus on the long wave economic cycle. This is going back to a lot of the things that you've written and said before. You say the U.S. been in a long wave, 50, 60-year cycle, economic downturn, partially reversed by the debt bubble, and you're saying it's not just a recent phenomenon. Private debt, but here's what I like. There are signs that this is changing. Private debt is being restructured. Technology is bursting out. U.S. competitiveness has improved hugely. U.S. manufacturing is relocating back to the U.S. I didn't know those things were actually going that well. So you do see signs of hope.
Yeah, what I'd like to do is just talk for a minute just on this long wave thing, because this is never discussed in public forums in the United States or in the election. But the long cycle, it's a 50 to 60 year cycle that's been well documented going back hundreds of years. And it's got to do with innovation and technology, new innovation, new technology, building new industries. They get, built up over time. You get a lot of growth. You get overbuilt. You get excess capacity. It goes into decline. And you have to go
and
through
a new
this.
innovation comes along.
And there's a credit cycle that's built into that. And so what's happened, just very quickly, is that the U.S. went into this long wave decline back in the 1970s, 1980s. You can see it with the car industry and steel and so on, and outsourcing to China and other places. And then what the government did is they really encouraged the public to go into debt to try to elevate their living standards other than through a rise in income. Because middle class incomes have gone flat for the last 30 years. You can look at it in any chart. Real middle class incomes have gone flat. So you got this credit bubble built up on top of the long wave decline. So when the bubble burst, then you had the full downswing of the long wave, with the car industry going broke, financial institutions that got overbuilt in the credit bubble, they went bust, et cetera. So what I said in the book that I wrote, The Great Reflation, 3 years ago, was that we probably had another 5 years to go in this long wave decline, and then we're going to come out of it with new industries, new technology, new innovation.
And that has begun, you're saying?
And so that has begun, and I think there's a real message of hope there that people shouldn't get too bearish and too fixated on declinism in the United States. You can see it, as I said, in technology. It's breaking out. Energy technology, we see what's going on. The U.S. Has got a good chance of being energy independent, sometime in the next 15 or 20 years.
Yes,
and nobody dreamed that could happen 3 years ago. Medical technology is changing dramatically, which promises to cut the cost of medical services in the United States, which is an outrage. The Americans spend something like twice as much money as Canadians, and the success rate is far worse. They're not getting value for money. So a lot of really good things are happening there. The U.S., as another example, U.S. Unit labor costs, that's the cost of wages adjusted for productivity, now is outpaced the Chinese. They've gained relative to the Chinese by about 60% in the last 15 years. Energy costs, U.S. electricity costs are about half the cost of German electricity costs. It's driving the Europeans nuts. And so American industries, manufacturing are migrating back to the United States.
So these are like the flowers growing among the weeds here. These are the signs of a garden to come.
And this is being reinforced by technology, which is now a lot cheaper. Just because a country's got cheaper wages, lower wages, it doesn't help in a lot of industries because there are robotics and things like that that the Americans can use just as well as the Chinese. And
So we made the same mistake with the Japanese. We thought they were invincible and they were going to take us over. Look at them today. The Chinese, then, we made the same mistake. We thought, oh, there's no way we can beat that, but actually might not be true.
Yeah, exactly. That's what's happening. So anyway, I think it's really important for people to understand this long wave, that we are going to come out of it. There will be new industries. They are getting put in place, as we speak. And so I think, my point on this is that what the president should do is focus on the new industries and do what he can to help them grow faster and faster, and not worry too much about stopping the decline of the old industries, because they're going to decline anyway.
But if he makes a mistake like Solyndra, he gets whacked and ridiculed. There's a risk there, the political risk. He'll help the wrong industry.
Yeah. Anyway, there's clearly a political element, but there's things he can do. Immigration, for example. You've got 50% youth unemployment in Greece and Spain, and it's very high in France. We should be, when I say we, the United States, but Canada, we should be over there recruiting like crazy and get these Greek and Spanish engineers and high-tech people that are out of work and on the streets and riding because they can't get a job. Bring them over here and get them to work and get them to create some new industry here.
You're right, that is a good idea.
We need to educate people. We got 20-some-odd million people unemployed in the United States. I've forgotten exactly the number. This is an incredible waste. We need to educate people for the new industries. And that way we're going to raise productivity, we're going to increase growth, and it's out of this increased growth that they're going to get the revenues to pay for the entitlements that have been promised.
Okay, number 5 among the 10 do's and don'ts, so the 5th and last do. Infrastructure spending to fill gap before next long wave upswing really gets underway. Protection from floods, you mentioned. Of course, we know why that would be extremely important at this point. If rate of return over 30 years is greater than the 3% cost of 30-year money, it's a no-brainer. And yet, it's hard to not to confuse that with just stimulus spending and quantitative easing, you know?
Yeah.
And that's what people fear. What's the difference?
Well, I think this is a really important point. And first of all, there's a huge need for infrastructure spending in the United States. I mean, the roads, the bridges, the dams, the levees in New Orleans, you name it, the airports, the railroads. They all need a huge amount of spending to, put them up to modern standards. And but if you mix spending of infrastructure with just running fiscal deficits because of, say, for example, entitlements are bigger than revenue, it's a different thing. Because if you build a new bridge, you've got an asset behind that expenditure, if you had to borrow money.
Sure.
Whereas if you just run a deficit, you got no asset at the end of the day. You just spent money, and you build up the debt. And
but if you're out of money, if as a government you're pretty much out of it, does it matter? You're out of it. You don't even have it for infrastructure spending. Or do you?
Well, there's a lot of perception in this idea of what is government debt and the ratios of government debt to GDP, and really the way people should look at it, and I think it's not hard to sell the idea, is to say, okay, we're going to borrow money for 30 years at 3%. We're going to put it into call it a special government corporation, and we put the asset in there, and we put the debt, the 30-year bond that we sold at 3%. And if the government can get more than a 3% rate of return
from the asset,
it's a no-brainer. So I mean, just
true.
imagine if they built modern levees in New Orleans before the storm. If you look at the money they would have saved from having to rebuild the city
and charge boat owners or whoever.
Yeah, and the same with New York with the
airports,
and the same with airports and building better roads and railroads, and you're going to get a rate of return. It's hard to measure it sometimes.
So you're saying really separate them very clearly and legislatively so that there isn't this confusion.
So it's sort of like an off-budget item, and then and I don't think people get caught up in it, because clearly the U.S. doesn't yet have the perception of a fiscal problem, because they can still borrow money 10 years at 1.6% the last time I looked. 30 years they can borrow at for probably under 3%. Those are very low rates of rent. So the public at large, people that are investing in bonds, don't have this perception the U.S. is ready to go broke. I think if they could separate,
useful spending,
the debt from just deficits, and the debt because you're building up infrastructure and getting an asset that generates a return.
Yeah, and that's very much a marketing job. It's like having Resolution Trust for when savings and loan was. If you have a clear vehicle for that.
Yeah.
So it's a good one. It's a good do. Now the don'ts, which are fun too. Number one, don't try to do too many things. Focus, focus, focus. Pick your battles, and go to the people if Congress obstructs.
I think focus is a big thing, and getting the message across. And don't get bogged down in details. Don't try to do too many things. You try to do too many things, you're going to fail at all of them. You're not going to be successful on anything.
Well, Obamacare once again.
And Obamacare. And you're going to get a certain amount of obstruction from some of the more doctrinaire Republicans. You've got to figure out a way how to isolate them, work with the moderates, and don't get bogged down in the negativism of Congress. And also you've got to reach out to other leaders in society too, corporations at the state and local level, because that's where change really takes place, is the state and local level. Yeah. You got to work with those people,
the mayors,
and isolate the obstructionists and humiliate them, embarrass them in public if you have to.
Yeah, if you need to. And it's funny, when President Obama decided that Osama bin Laden had to be taken down, there he was doing in foreign policy what he should have done maybe domestically. He had a very clear goal.
Yeah, exactly.
And you could recognize that it was done.
Yeah,
and he got the credit for it, and maybe domestically that would work as well. Number two, don't pretend that the president has a lot of power. He doesn't. His job is to lead, set the right agenda, get wide support, work with Congress, and embarrass those who obstruct out of self-interest. So maybe tone down the expectation on himself.
Tone down the expectation, and probably every president, is guilty of this. Is they make it sound like they can do everything, and I think there's a general perception that the president has a lot more power than he does. Presidents really don't have a lot of power. They're like the CEO of a company, and the people that really execute policy are the people that run the divisions underneath him. And so he's got to make that clear. This is how I'm running the country, like Ronald Reagan did. And I'm above all that. And don't expect me to do too many things, but I've got the right people in place, and they're going to, execute for me.
Number three is one I recognize from our last discussion, and who could disagree? Don't get into stupid foreign wars and stupid geopolitical mistakes. get the economy strong, and use new economic muscle like the Chinese do, backed by potent military. Teddy Roosevelt, carry a big stick but talk softly. Don't use the military, just have it.
Yeah, if you got
It's a lot less costly.
If you got the military there, and there's a lot of intimidation that you can use without actually having to use it, and that's ideal. And the Americans, you know, everybody I think understands this. They get involved in wars they shouldn't have got involved in. They haven't exactly lost them, they haven't exactly won them, but they got bogged down. It's cost trillions of dollars.
Yes.
They've ruined their reputation in virtually all parts of the world, and they don't really have a whole lot to show for it. And
would you agree that I think it was Maureen Dowd who doesn't always say nice things about Ronald Reagan, but she said at least he knew how to bluff wars and keep it a bluff and make it work. These other neocons they bluff it, but then they'd have to do it.
Yeah,
and then it costs a fortune.
Sure. Yeah, I think bluffmanship is keep your hand covered, but you're there as a threat if people don't stay in line, because there's a certain amount of being the world policeman. The U.S. has got a role that it's fallen on them and they got to play it. But I don't think you have to get involved in every single battle all over the world, because the Americans have shown they can't do that. The economic declines of empires, there's been a ton of books written. The one common ingredient is superpower states always overextend themselves financially, politically, militarily, and that's one of the reasons for their downfall. So you got to be economically strong, and your economic strength has got to be compatible with your military projection.
So Ron Paul has it right in some ways, and they call him an isolationist, but maybe they shouldn't. When you think of it.
There's degrees of isolationism, and what the U.S. did in the 30s was...
But he says we could trade with everybody and grow prosperous by it, instead of trying to whack everybody or whack the bad guys, even if they are bad guys.
That's an option, yeah. When you train your allies, get your allies to take responsibility, because everybody will run under the cover of the American umbrella, military umbrella, if they can. Canada's one of the biggest villains.
Not pay our share.
So make people pay their share.
Number 4, very interesting as well. Stop China bashing. They have problems of their own, including a big decline in competitiveness. We need them as an ally. There's an original thought. But play tough, i.e., if we can't buy their companies, then why should we let them buy ours? If they demand access to tech for entry, then that's the quid pro quo for the U.S. So tougher on business-wise, but no bashing on currency and on the military.
Yeah, in many ways, what the Chinese have done, they've had a very undervalued currency. They've had all this super growth, big export-led model, like the Japanese did back in the 50s and 60s and 70s. But their economy is getting, incredibly distorted, like the Japanese did. So, one thing about economics, adjustments do take place. When you get distortions, the market will correct things, and that's happening in China. They've overbuilt many industries.
Yes, they have.
They've lost competitiveness in a whole lot of different places. They're not at the cutting edge of technology like the United States is. They're good in technology, but not at the cutting edge. And one of the things that American companies do is they're all scrambling to get into this huge Chinese market. And so the Chinese demand, when a company goes in, like GE or whatever, they'll say, you can only come in if you give us your technology. We'll let you build a factory, but you got to have a joint venture partner. And that's terrible. And a lot of American companies now have understood that's bad business. And I think we got to get a quid pro quo from China.
It's hard to get. I mean, they come in Canada. We have the same debate. They want to buy our companies, but then even their workers, they want to have them subject to our laws.
Yeah,
they repatriate them.
Yeah.
I mean, that's going to be a tough negotiation.
Tough one, but really what you got to do is say, it's got to be tit for tat. We can't buy your companies in energy, then you can't buy ours. Can't buy your technology companies, then you can't buy ours.
And they'll eventually get the message.
Yeah.
Number 5, last of the 10 do's and don'ts. Don't obstruct the drive for energy independence. If the U.S. can get there, it's a huge game changer. So you're obliquely referring to Keystone and things like that, I assume.
Keystone is one example. At the lower levels, there's a lot of concern about this horizontal drilling and fracking and potential pollution and so on. My understanding is, and I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is that I think the environmentalists have really got their oar in there, and they're blocking a lot of stuff that is really not appropriate. The Keystone Project is another one. It was all politics, and you know, the U.S. is on track to be the biggest gas producer ahead of Russia by 2015, absolutely. Within 3 or 4 years,
and a big oil producer with the Boeckh field and so on.
Yeah, and they're on track to be a bigger oil producer than Saudi Arabia, and they're on track potentially to be energy independent. And this gets rid of this massive current account deficit the U.S. has been running. It's going to be good for the U.S. dollar. It could be a real game changer combined with the competitive thing we talked about earlier to really rejuvenate, kickstart this.
And so you're telling the president, don't obstruct that.
Don't obstruct
for your friends in Hollywood.
Yeah, that's right.
Your green friends.
Yeah, yeah. We got to get that energy. And that also changes the whole geopolitical calculation too. The Middle East is going to be a lot less important to us if we don't have to buy their oil.
Well, he's got a big job ahead of him, Tony, but we had a big job. We had to get all 10 do's and don'ts into the time we had, and we just did. And so congratulations, thank you, and come back. We'll do the midterms.
Okay, well, that's great. Thank you very much.
Tony Boeckh was our guest this week on Entrepreneurs, the Fiera series of the World Show. I'm Bob Scully. Have a great week. Thanks.